So hi everyone, my name is Michelle and I'm from Holistic Pillars. You would have seen the site or the blog that you're looking at right now. And with me today I have the wonderful Vicky Friedman Kuriel, LCHF Dietitian, that I came across a few years ago. Welcome Vicky, and thanks for coming along today.
Thanks Michelle, thanks for having me.
Now I want to preface the conversation by saying that we're on this Holistic Pillars because this was a bit of a creation of mine based on my own personal story and personal transformation. And the site is all about sharing a journey and what I've learnt and the transformation and the health benefits that I've had in making some lifestyle changes. And one of those in particular, of course, is around nutrition. Now, when I went into my discovery phase and I was going to every seminar and conference and summit and whatnot out there, I came across you. And I found, I think it was the Australian Health and Wellness Summit? No.
Yeah, did speak at that one. Yep.
Vicky up on stage telling us all about the benefits of low carb living and changing lifestyles. So I'm sitting there thinking, I think I need to go and see that girl. So I booked myself in. So that's sort of when I kicked, and I'd already probably done a bit of paleo or was discovering paleo and more the quality of the food that we eat, but I hadn't really looked at low carb. So I trotted along and saw you, and I thought it was fantastic because it basically validated my thoughts around paleo and healthy food and all that sort of stuff. And I think at the time, and I'm going back maybe about 5 or 6 years, I think, with you, and just tweaked what I needed to do, and then off we went. But what I'd like to know now is, you're not your standard dietitian, you are LCHF. Now, would you be able to give me a little bit of background on how you came about being LCHF, or what we're calling low carb, high fat or healthy fat dietitian? So what's your background?
Yeah, I think, if I look back now and I look at my journey to practicing the way that I do, it's probably a combination of the way that I was brought up, the home that I grew up in, my parents, my extended family, the environment that I was in. I grew up in South Africa. We were very much an active, healthy family. So we spent time bike riding, hiking, always doing stuff. We were, the great outdoors was our playground as a family. And I remember this from the youngest of ages. I was also a very competitive gymnast, and so was exposed to nutrition through that world. Our home was always full of healthy, whole foods. Mum didn't like buying packaged foods, and that's what I grew up on. And, we were always extremely healthy. My extended family was extremely healthy. My grandparents, everybody, there were no real metabolic diseases or inflammatory diseases, nothing. And I didn't really think about it at the time. And through probably my gymnastics, more so than anything, pushed me to learn more about nutrition. We were very much spoken to about calorie control and keeping ourselves very lean as gymnasts. And I competed at a national level, so it was a huge part of my life. And so the area of nutrition was of interest to me from a very young age. And so that's where my studies led me. And I also did a whole bunch of exercise. I became a personal trainer when I was studying at uni, and that's the way I sort of supported myself through those university years. So I was immersed in the fitness industry from a very young age. And so when I got to actually doing my Masters of Nutrition and Dietetics, I was very confused with the messages that were being put out there. A lot of the treatment protocols or the recommendations were quite contrary to what I had known as healthy eating my whole life. And I did question these, but at the same time, I also thought, well, this is probably emerging science. These are people who have been in the industry for many years. They must know more and better than what I do. And so I listened to what they were saying, but there was always this nagging voice in the back of my mind that told me that things were not quite right. And I questioned it a lot and got really put in my place by lecturers or supervisors on placement. I actually had to move hospitals on one of my placements because one of my supervisors couldn't handle my questions, my endless questions, and asked that I be moved to another hospital. And so it was quite controversial. My thoughts were quite controversial, but I always knew that there needed to be something more. And then I had a few very significant situations that validated that what I was doing was not the best practice. I had a few, one specific one was a diabetic outpatient clinic where I saw a father and son who were both morbidly obese. The son was, not even in his teens yet was probably around about 80 kilograms, both so unhealthy. And I wanted to tell them the truth of what to eat, but my hands were tied. In those situations, in those clinical settings, I was very much governed by the dietary guidelines of Australia and the recommendations that the hospital put forward, and I had to go with those, and I didn't have any room to move within that myself. And eventually I had to, for my own personal belief and ethics, move away from those systems and only move into private practice. And in private practice, that's where I could actually practice the way that I truly believed was right. And it wasn't just a belief system for me. Following my time at university, I began reading endlessly, thinking that there must be additional research out there that maybe we weren't exposed to. And I was spot on. There was plenty of research that was being, whether it was ignored or just not looked into correctly, or a lot of studies that were perhaps observational or epidemiological studies were being read into too much. And so I learned about different types of studies and how to read studies and how to analyze the science correctly. And everything that I believed in regards to eating real food, which is my absolute mantra, having whole real food as the basis of your diet, was validated through all of this. And so, since being in private practice, which is now about 12 odd years, I went to practicing this way and have had tremendous success across the board with people from everything from losing weight to correcting or reversing metabolic disease, inflammatory disease, to enhancing sports performance, to optimizing life, to improving energy levels, sleeping better, you name it, just by simply adopting the mantra of eating real food.
Fantastic. And we love that terminology, JEF. I use it all the time.
Yeah.
It's just eat real food. And I think you drummed that into me right back in the early days, just eat real food. And it can't be much simpler than that, can it? So
absolutely.
You, through your recommendations over the years, you very much went to the low carb way of living. And are you able to tell me, like, in a, easiest of terms for people starting out, why LCHF, or low carb, high fat, or any low carb, and I'll talk about that in a minute, and what are the actual benefits of taking on a low carb diet?
So there are many benefits, but the one that strikes me is that if you look at the 3 macronutrients, which are carbohydrate, protein, and fat, the one that is not essential to life is carbohydrate. So we could, now I'm not recommending you don't have any carbohydrate, but I just want to put this into perspective. We could live full, healthy lives without having any carbohydrate in our diet whatsoever. Now, fat and protein are both essential. We have to have them in our diets in order to live. If we don't have a certain amount of protein or a certain amount of fat, we will get certain deficiency diseases and we will become very ill and will increase mortality. Whereas carbohydrate, we actually don't need. So when you think about the recommendations that are current in Australia that tell us that our diet should be roughly 60% carbohydrate, you begin questioning why on earth that would be the case when this is the non-essential macronutrient that we're talking about here. And so that was probably, that's the first thing that I want people to recognize. The other thing is that a lot of carbohydrate dense foods, such as flours and grains and cereals, all of those sorts of things, they do not come together with many other nutrients. So they give you a whack of calories, and they give you a whack of carbohydrates, but they don't give you anything else or much else. And if they do, it's usually because those products have been fortified with those nutrients. So like breakfast cereals might have been fortified. When I say fortified, we've got these micronutrients, vitamins and minerals that have been added in. So they're not naturally occurring. And when things are not naturally occurring, we don't absorb them as well. So we try and put the nutrients into these carbohydrate-based foods, but are we really, what are we doing? How well are we actually going to absorb them? So high carbohydrate foods are often very nutrient poor. So they're not giving us a whole bunch of essential micronutrients, vitamins, minerals, antioxidant, that sort of thing. The other thing is that when we look at the population in Australia, we have become, as a population group, more and more unhealthy. And when I say more and more unhealthy, what I'm really referring to is that we've become more and more insulin resistant. And if we make, what is insulin resistance in its most simplest form, it's an intolerance to carbohydrate. So if we've got a population where we've got the majority of people who are not tolerating carbohydrate, they cannot process the carbohydrate very well, it causes issues for them one way or another, why would we be recommending that approximately 60% of the diet be this macronutrient? So those are probably the three main things that we want to consider. So once you put all of those things together, it makes a lot of sense to me that we reduce carbohydrate to maybe 10, 20, 30%, depending on the individual's health, level of insulin resistance, their goals, their environment and what they want to achieve. And then you have protein and fat making up the other component, where those nutrients are more important and play a massive role in not only keeping us healthy, but keeping us satiated as well.
Absolutely. Now you just touched on something, one size, not one size fits all. So in my knowledge in the low carb world, we've got different levels of your low carb. So you're starting off with your paleo, and then you've got low carb, and then you've got keto, and now the latest, a lot of chat around carnivore. And so upon your recommendations, and I know that there are different ratios of carbs, proteins and fats depending on, so I think, is it low carb itself is like between 50 and 100, or is it higher than that? I'm just trying to work out.
There's no official definition for any of this.
Yeah.
So there is no body, I guess, that has come out and said these are the criteria and these are the levels, but you could roughly put these into some sort of context. So for most, if we start off with keto, because that's probably the best one or the easiest one to classify, in order for most people to be in a ketogenic state, they would need to have carbohydrates below 50 grams. Now, I'm saying most people, but some people actually need them to be below 20 grams carbohydrates per day, I'm talking about, in order to be in a ketogenic state. You mentioned carnivore, and carnivore is a very new approach, and I wouldn't be recommending that anyone just jumps into that. I would use it only in therapeutic situations. There's not very much evidence around the long-term implications of carnivore, so it can be extremely beneficial on a therapeutic level, but basically you're not having any plant-based foods, and so your level of carbohydrate in your diet is absolutely minuscule. Some people do have honey on carnivore, and so that can contribute substantially. There's very mixed messages around carnivore, and so the level of carbohydrate is not really what is up for discussion really when it comes to carnivore. It's more where the food is coming from and the avoidance of plant-based foods. Then you've got low carb, and then depending on how you want to classify, low carb can be ketogenic at times, so it could be below 50, but some people would say that low carb would sit probably below 120 grams. So if you roughly put it between 50 and 120 grams, that would probably be about right. But what is really interesting is that you could have people who are extremely insulin sensitive, and I've seen this with quite a few athletes. So they're very, very tolerant of carbohydrates, and they process and digest and absorb and all of that really quickly. And they can actually be in a ketogenic state with carbs up at 100 and 120 per day. So then our classification goes up and disappears. So I'm not a big one for classifying things, and I'm also not big on counting macronutrients because it varies so significantly for people. What I am big on is trial and error, and I don't think there's enough of that. I don't think enough of people actually engage in that. I think we are quite scared to do that. What will happen if I maybe have a bit too much of something for a while? Will that cause my health to become worse, or will I put on weight? But unfortunately, that is the best way. We have to try different approaches to understand how our bodies work and what's going to be best for us. The other point is that when most people come off of a typical Australian diet, which is way too high in carbohydrate, in my personal opinion, in order to get themselves to a point where they are feeling well again, where they are feeling that they can engage in a bit of trial and error and do that quite effectively, I would say that they need to start off by dropping their carbohydrates to less than 50 grams per day, and do that for a period of several months, get themselves to a point of feeling better and at a more comfortable weight, and then start playing around with finding what their actual optimal level is.
It's very good, because one thing you've also taught me is to eat when hungry until full, and to trust my body, and to start, what's the word? It's eating the right things to be satiated for longer periods of time. And I think I can now go, you'd be the same, but and I don't want to also follow a fasting protocol necessarily, because I just naturally fast anyway. One meal a day, maybe two, and if I'm really hungry, I might have a third. I don't know, doesn't happen very often. But they call that fat adaption. So if you're going into a low carb diet, it would take a significant period of time before you become fat adapted. Can you just really easily explain the kindling burning versus the logs, and how we get into a fat adapted state and what that could mean to the body? Is that easy to explain?
Yeah, so fat adaptation, it happens quickly having the ability to use fat can happen quickly, but being able to do that as a preference and your body to preferentially use fat as opposed to using carbohydrate for energy can take months. So in the initial phases, when you lower carbohydrate to below 50 grams per day, let's say, your body, which is used to using carbohydrate, will go into a little bit of a shock horror situation because it's searching for the carbohydrates and they're not there, they're not available anymore. And so in the initial 48 hours or so of reducing carbohydrate, what generally happens is that you will utilize all of your carbohydrate stores. So that be in your liver and in your skeletal muscle, and your body will use all of that up as fuel. And then eventually you'll get to a point where the carbohydrate that you have remaining is just not sufficient. And then what generally happens to people is they hit a lull for a few days where their bodies are not quite ready or not able to access and use fat as an alternative fuel just yet, but they also don't have enough carbohydrate on board anymore to use that as the fuel source. And so they're in like this no man's land for a short period of time. And this is often referred to as the low carbohydrate flu. And you might get some symptoms. Some people feel a little bit lethargic and low in energy or even a bit dizzy, but there are ways to get around that and for that to not be as bad. But following that period, your insulin levels start coming down, and your insulin is basically your fat storage hormone. So as soon as your insulin levels circulating in your blood start coming down, you then have the ability to pull fat out of storage and to start using the fat as a fuel. And when you are able to do this, then this is the first level or first stage of accessing fat or fat adaptation. Now, at this point, maybe you're a week in to adopting a low carbohydrate approach. If you had to then go and eat some carbohydrates, your body would go straight back. They'd go, yay, here's the fuel, and you'd forget about the fat and you just go straight back to using the carbohydrate again because your preference is carbohydrate. It's just easier for your body at this point to use carbohydrate as fuel. But over time, if you have been pretty disciplined, motivated, you've got a strong reason to stay on a low carbohydrate for a period of time, the longer you stay on this low carbohydrate approach, the better and better you become at using fat. And you begin using fat when it's most appropriate to use fat, and using carbohydrate when it's most appropriate to use carbohydrate. Now, when are those situations? Well, most of the day, we are better at using fat. So when we're sitting around, having a chat like this, sleeping, sitting on the couch, working at our desks, we should be using fat because our heart rate and our physiological state is such that fat is our best fuel at that point. But if you had to go and do something like a high intensity exercise session and your heart rate went through the roof and you were breathing really heavily, your body would want to access some carbohydrate. Now, the small amount that you eat can contribute to that. And we also have an ability in our body to make carbohydrate from other things. So we don't actually have to eat carbohydrate to have carbohydrate available. Now, when we're in a situation that we access fat when it's appropriate to access fat and use that fat as a fuel, and then we can access carbohydrate when it's appropriate to use carbohydrate, and we can switch between these two. We call this being metabolically flexible, and that is the ultimate. that is the ultimate level of being fat adapted. And this generally happens to people who have stuck with a low carb approach for at least 6 months and maybe even a bit more. So, I take a good example being my husband, who's been on a low carb. We've both been following low carb for a good 12 plus years now, pretty stringently. We're not saints. We do indulge in high sugar, high fat things every now and then, like normal humans do, but generally that's our day-to-day diet. And he could go out for a 4, 5, 6 hour bike ride and have nothing but water because he's riding at a pretty steady state, and it's appropriate for him to just access fat the whole time. But if during that ride there is, a massive uphill and he's, a bit of ego comes into play and he's with the group of guys and he wants to get to the top first, he has the ability to have that carbohydrate available that he's converted from other bits and pieces in his body and use that. So he's extremely metabolically flexible. And that's what we're aiming for. When you're in that state, there are so many advantages. And the one that probably is most appropriate and resonates for most people is just that steady state of good energy levels all day long. None of this roller coaster ride up and down, feeling lethargic, the 3 or 4 o'clock slump. That's not a real thing. Like, that shouldn't be happening. And if it's happening to you, it's because you're reliant on carbohydrates and you're now having this dip. Whereas when you're reliant on fat and you're fat adapted, you have this steady state of energy all day long, and it's wonderful.
Because and I totally agree with you, because one of the big things I've noticed for myself is this calm. So you're owning what's going into your body and the quality of what's going into your body, and you're stable. I don't ever feel like it's just this calmness and this clear head and a number of other things. Now, when going way back with our journey, and why we're even talking about this was, we were both in pretty bad ways metabolically. And there was one terminology that was used all the time, and I never got my head around what it meant, is metabolic syndrome. Now, this is probably going to umbrella everything that we've been talking about as to what metabolic syndrome is, a cluster of a number of syndromes or factors. We just talk a little bit about those, because I think when I would come to you and I'd say, here's my blood work that the doctor's done. What are you looking for? And where is that inflammation, or where's the indicators that the inflammation and the particular tests that are being done that a low carb diet or adapting a low carb way of living and a number of other things that, sleep and rest and exercise and those sort of things can help correct that metabolic syndrome, which in my case has been completely reversed, pre-diabetic, eczema, IBS, a number of other things. So can we just have a little chat about that?
Yeah, so if you look at, the classification of metabolic syndrome, it's also referred to as syndrome X. There's very definite criteria that we would classify people into in order to say, yes, they have metabolic syndrome. But and those definitions, I remember from my hospital clinical days, and so many people being admitted, metabolic syndrome. And we're basically a cluster of things, significantly overweight. So your BMI being above, I think in order for, I'm not going to give you exact amounts because I don't know them anymore, because to me, as I said before, those numbers are not the important thing. It's where people are moving that's important to me. So I think it's above 28, but it might be 30 as a BMI, as a classification, which is in the high end of the overweight and moving into the obese category of BMI. And BMI is an issue on itself, but we won't go there. And then we have diabetes being amongst that. So blood sugar levels tending towards becoming in the diabetic range or within the diabetic range already. The next thing is a high blood pressure. So high blood pressure is a classic, one of the classic metabolic syndrome things. We're also looking at cholesterol levels, and typically we would be looking at total cholesterol and LDL, which I don't 100% agree with. I think we should be looking at triglyceride, and we should be looking more at the ratios. But basically it's a cluster of these diseases that we see so commonly in people in modern societies such as Australia. And if we look at what the thing in common, like sometimes someone has all of them, sometimes 3 or 4 or whatever it might be, but what the commonality here is a level of insulin resistance. All of these diseases can be brought back to that one thing, which is insulin resistance. And if we know that there's this commonality, then what we need to be doing is targeting the commonality in our treatment protocol. So many people are just treating the high blood pressure, treating the diabetes, treating with medication, all these things, rather than saying, what could we do to improve the insulin resistance? Is there some lifestyle changes that could be done to make this person more sensitive to insulin, to reduce their insulin levels in their body? And of course, you know the answer to that. And a lower carbohydrate diet, real food-based diet, lower calories in your diet can all contribute to reducing the amount of insulin resistance. And then all those other little lifestyle things that we can put on top of it. We know that even, you know, interesting things such as cold water immersion, have time in a sauna, better sleep, you know, quality and quantity of sleep, exercise, all these sorts of things can also have an impact on improving the insulin resistance or making someone more sensitive. So we instead of just focusing on this metabolic disease or metabolic syndrome as such, we need to go back and see, you know, what is contributing from a lifestyle, and where's the commonality, and moving from there. So hopefully that explains a little bit, but
because it's a big topic, I know, and
yeah.
You know, I was looking at weight. You know, I walked into my GP, my mainstream GP, many years ago, and yes, I had high cholesterol, and but he never looked at the breakdown of LDL, HDL, and tris, and just wanted to put me on statins, and I refused. And I thought, I've got to fix this. But then I didn't know where to go to find the answers, and I didn't know the simple ways that I could turn my diet around to fix all this stuff. And it's coming true. And I'm concentrating more on things like meditation now, and quality of sleep and stresses and stuff like that. Like, I'm understanding now more the impact of cortisol in raised insulin. I never really understood that actually is also another factor that can raise insulin, which is this underlying issue that we've all got, as well as the quality of what we eat, like the oils. People don't understand the damage of sugars and oils and all that sort of stuff that's in our food. So that's probably another whole other topic. I don't know how we're going for time. How are we going for time? I'll one last little thing, Vic.
Yeah.
I think, you know, I consider you, although we didn't have a lot of face-to-face contact, it was mainly through your programs. So I think I did the first one you ever rolled out, which was the 6-week low carb challenge through your clinic, Eat, Play, Thrive, where your husband Joe is the chiropractor, and your Pilates and gym and all that sort of stuff, and you've got a great little practice going. And COVID's hitting that a little bit at the moment, so I'm not sure what's happening there, but I know that you ran the program, and it's turned into being quite a fantastic 6-week online program, and everything we've talked about today and more is outlined in this 6-week program. And I don't know how many times I've done that program, but it just constantly reminds me of I've forgotten about that. You know, and it's sort of like just been this constant education. Is that you're going to be continuing with the program? Because I know that there's also the mastery program which I've also done, and 2 programs which are fantastic.
Yeah, so absolutely. The 6-week, the reason why I started the 6-week low carb challenge is because I was only consulting one-on-one, and I was finding that regardless of what people were coming in with, whether they were trying to lose weight, whether they were trying to improve energy levels, whether they had diabetes, that they were trying to come off their medication, or there were all sorts of different reasons people were coming in to see me. But the starting point to get things moving in the right direction for 99% of these people was the same. And so I would find that I would be saying the same thing to everyone. And I found it really difficult to get the message across in an hour consult. An hour consult is really short. So by the time I've learned about them, they've told me their history, their goals, what they want to achieve from this, half an hour is already gone. And then I have to explain to the individual in half an hour how to make massive dietary changes. And I could never find the balance. Sometimes I knew that I was having people leave my consult feeling completely overwhelmed and therefore not taking any action because it all just seemed too hard and too much, or they were given too little information and just had too many questions. And so I was losing so many people who I knew could benefit greatly.
When you have a call, don't leave your phone on.
So I knew many people could benefit if they knew the right way to go about things. So that's why I initially developed the 6-week program. It was really, initially, it was going to complement what I was doing in my one-on-one session. So what I now do is when I see somebody, when somebody does want to see me one-on-one, they see me one-on-one, I understand as much about them as possible, and then I give them access to the 6-week program so that they can go step by step by step. Every day they learn a little bit more, they implement something different, they do a little bit more, and slowly, without any overwhelm, they understand what this lifestyle is all about and how to implement it into their own situations. And so it's a real educational process, and there's lots of tools and recipes and all sorts of, if you want to listen to the higher level evidence and science, that's provided as well. If you just want the practical how-to, then that's there too. So it gives them that real ability to implement the diet, and I'm there holding their hands literally every step of the way because they have the support through the Facebook group, which is where I'm available to answer questions as they go as well. And so instead of losing people after that first consult, suddenly people were right on board and people were becoming part of a community. The Facebook group really pulls people together and they have commonalities, and there's discussion and sharing and all sorts that goes on. And so the 6-week program will definitely continue. It's available online. People can join that at any time, and they can either just jump on and join, or they can see me and then join as well. So it depends on how people are, but I'd say most of the time people do not need to see me for that one-on-one. Often I find that that one-on-one can be more beneficial when people have finished the 6-week challenge and then have a few little tweaks or specific things that they need assistance with. And then the mastery program evolved out of that, because it was then, well, how do we do this forever after? How do we make this just stick as a lifestyle forever? How can I trial and error safely and effectively? And what are some other little bits of information that I'd like to know about? And so that's where the mastery program comes in. That's a 12-week program. There's a lot of higher level information in that program, and it just helps people to really cement this as a lifestyle.
And precisely that, it's a lifestyle. What I've loved the most about your programs and working with you, and obviously all the other stuff that I've done behind the scenes, is that you stick to the science and data. So if you come to your forum and your community with a question, it's always backed by science, the latest science. And if you don't know, you'll go find out and come back with, well, actually there's nothing in the literature, or there's nothing in the research that says this, or this. Or whatever it might have been. So it's been a great community of learning, I think, as well for me. Last question. What would be your top 3 tips if you were wanting to explore the world of low carb? So for me, it would be something like making sure you understand your why. That would be my top one. What would be something that you would say to people?
So if somebody is thinking that they want to explore this, I would say, my very first thing would be just do it. Just jump in and learn as you go. So many people need everything to be lined up before they dive in. And one of my mantras is progress before perfection. And I think even if you do a few things wrong, in inverted commas, you can't really do all that much wrong. So maybe you eat something that you're really not meant to, or, if you make some good changes and then you build on that. So progress before perfection is certainly the first thing that I would be saying. I would also be saying, understand your reasons for doing this, because and I agree with you 100%, and I go on and on about it. In the preparation phase of my challenge, which is a week prior to the challenge, I spend a lot of time helping everybody get prepared, and I speak about identifying your why, because it gets tough. There are times when your environment is such, there might be peer pressure, there might be a whole range of things going on that, put you in a position where it's easier to grab a bag of chips or a sandwich or whatever it might be. And if you don't have a strong enough reason why, and you're not fully connected to that reason, the bag of chips will be more powerful. And you need your why to be more powerful than the chips. And when it is, it's actually really easy to keep moving in the right direction. So knowing your real reason why. And I speak through in the challenge how to identify that, asking yourself a series of questions over and over and over again. The other thing is that if you don't know what to do and you want to get started, here it comes again, is JERF. Just eat real food. So if you can identify exactly what the food is and what's in it, then go ahead and eat it. So a good example of that is, you've got a piece of meat. What's that? Well, it's just meat. There's nothing else. But next to it at the butcher is a piece of meat that's been marinated by the butcher. Now, what's in that? Well, we don't really know. What's all the ingredients in the marinade? In a bottle of marinade, you start reading all those ingredients. Do you know what they all are? Can you identify them as being whole foods? So if you only eat whole foods, real foods that you can identify all components, God, you are like 90% of the way there. Because when we only eat whole real foods, our diet naturally becomes lower in carbohydrate, higher in protein and fat. So just eat real food is my absolute mantra that I stick with. And, when people are scared and they don't know what to do, just revert to that.
And that's one thing you've taught me. I think that's it for today. Thanks so much for the insights and simplifying the world of low carb. And it's not that scary and you get great benefits. So I really appreciate your time, and yeah, we'll chat soon.
Absolutely. Thanks, Mish. It's always good to chat.
Lovely. Thank you.